discuss national, regional, and international issues in depth. Held recently in the Kingdom of Bahrain under the patronage of Lieutenant Dr. Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdullah Al Khalifa, Chairman of the Supreme Council for Health, Chairman of Al Hikmah Retired Society, this year's Arab Pensions Conference gathered more than 450 delegates and a number of leading speakers to exchange views within a regional platform under the theme, "What should Mina pension systems look like for the next 50 years?" To answer this question and know more about the conference's agenda and outcomes, we are pleased to be joined here in the studio by pension researcher and chairman of the annual Mina Pensions Conference, Mr. Ibrahim Khalil Ibrahim. Welcome back. Joining me in the studio is a pension researcher and chairman of the annual Mina Pensions Conference, Mr. Ibrahim Khalil Ibrahim. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here.
Mr. Ibrahim, first, thank you for taking time to answer these questions. This conference was all over social media and media, actually, and the partake of it are the very big keynote speakers that were speaking there. So we just want to go into the details of this conference to make our viewers understand where it was coming from. So the Arab Pensions Conference is actually an annual event that highlights the importance of pension planning. Can you tell us more about the objectives and the importance of this event specifically?
Thanks, Sarah. We're trying to spread the word around the importance of pensions planning, pensions best practice, and pensions forward thinking. We believe, in fact, that there is hardly something more significant and economically impactful than pension, yet it's been overlooked by probably governments and households alike for decades. If you look at just the numbers, the global financial assets, all these investable assets around the world, they are estimated to be $250 trillion.
Okay.
Of that, $70 trillion is pension money. That's pension assets. It means, by the same token, that the pension sector is a major asset allocator, meaning the sector itself invests in local and international economies. And it's a heavyweight.
Yeah.
That's why a lot of articles and economic commentary talks about the pension power. So at the personal and social level, a lot of us, me, you, probably our brothers and sisters, everyone universally aspires to get a comfortable, dignified retirement. Yet only probably the countries that have achieved or reached adequate and sustainable pension arrangements are only a handful across the world. And many of the current pension funds that we see around, not just in the Middle East, but also in Europe, in Asia, Latin America, they have chronic flows and challenges that makes them something of a time bomb,
right.
A ticking social time bomb. And that's why these efforts for the conference like this is to bring the pension issues, the pension debate on agenda.
Right.
Yeah.
When we looked at the conference, the first thing that caught my eye was the actual title of the conference. It really gives that hope that there is a plan for the future. The motto was, "What should Mina pension systems look like for the next 50 years?" Was this year's theme of the Arab Pension Conference, can you tell us about why it is significant at this time specifically?
We try to create an emerging story out of it. So across the board, on average, probably this year is about the 50th anniversary or 50 years since many of the pension systems and social insurance systems in the Arab world were created. And in the first 40 years of these pension systems, the pension systems and social insurance systems have really thrived. In the GCC specifically, they've been supported by a strong oil economy, but also the pension fund themselves have a life cycle. And in the first 30 to 40 years, we see the pension assets, the people's money, the workers' money coming, and we have a fund asset allocations, or the fund accumulation is going faster than people coming out of the system and receiving the pension payout.
Right.
So in the first 40 years, pension funds were highly strong, solvent, and they met fully all their liabilities and the pensioner promise with a golden handshake.
Right.
The problem is the first 50 years, there was more money coming into the system than money coming out,
Yeah.
and we had the boosted or the booming oil economy.
Right.
The coming 50 years doesn't seem like to be the same 50 years that we have just thrived
Absolutely.
so far. So what we now have is since the start of these pension systems 50 years ago, longevity, or that is the likelihood of people living much higher than the normal life expectancy,
Yeah.
since 50 years, and this is now proven across the world. So we have an aging population, and this aging population is challenging the very model, the very calculus of pension system. And then beyond that, you have 60% of people in the MENA region across the Arab world, they are in the informal sector.
Right.
So if you look at the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Iraqis, the Moroccans, the Sudanese, if you look around, 60% are not under any official social
Right.
insurance. And our younger brothers and sons and daughters are being nudged to work in the gig economy, the knowledge economy, the platforms to become entrepreneurs. They might not necessarily have permanent employment with full-time contracts the way you and I, we've been having
Yes.
the last 20, 30 years. The other thing is the current pension funds are running chronic actuarial deficits with all this difficult mix. How do we want to design the pension funds and the social insurance system for the coming 50 years? And how do we want our children and their children to retire maybe 1 to 2 generations from today? Right. That's the theme of the conference, because we're trying to have some sort of forward thinking into the pension. Pension is universal, is crucial, is important to be ignored.
Absolutely. When I looked at the topics that were talked about and the individuals involved in it, not from the aspects of keynote speakers, but who you're talking for, as you've mentioned, you have the informal laborers, which was a very big point, because you're thinking across all of the eras. And at the same time, as you said, because we are an oil-based economy, but at the same time, we're getting out of that, and now more of the activities happening are outside of the oil-based income. So there is more tourism, there is more healthcare services, that kind of stuff. How do you see that changing in the next few years, especially now after the pandemic?
This is a key question. At least in the GCC, the pension liabilities, the pension promise has been written or was written by the petroleum wealth that we all have in the GCC. There are now new dynamics in the economy where the oil price is down to $50 and $60 against $150 probably till year 2014. So the cost and the bill of pensions globally ranges between 3 and sometimes in the very extreme cases up to 8 and 10% of GDP. That's a lot of money and it's very expensive. That's why the majority of pension systems, if they follow the defined benefit system, are running actuarial deficits, but that deficit ranges between probably a reasonable one, a natural one, and a very extreme one, and a very alarming one. Some of the countries in this region, we've already reached alarming funding levels, and this is worrisome. And this calls for, I would say, bold and forward-thinking legislative activity where we need to probably push the boundaries of the current thinking and put in place a bigger, wider institutional framework for pension and retirement security beyond the existing government pension funds.
Definitely. And because all of these points are important, they were also talked about and discussed during the conference. Can you tell us about the other topics that were discussed during the conference?
See, in the conference, this is an annual conference that touches upon all the pension issues and factors across the Arab world. But since the start in 2016, we had speakers from American, Japanese, Australian pension funds, and we had probably 28 countries, even from outside the region, participating. So this 2 days of, I would say, forum, we try to cover all the spectrum of the pension dynamics. So we started this year, the first session was about longevity and how to hedge. Longevity means, I mean, when you have a pension fund, so if Sarah works today, this is probably her first day of joining any work in Bahrain, and her employer registers her in the GOSI in here in Bahrain. It means that the GOSI of Bahrain has received a permanent liability for Sarah, because if anything, God forbid, happens to Sarah or this employee, then this GOSI, this fund, has to pay a promise, has to pay a liability for probably as long as Sarah is alive, and then maybe her survivors, the children, and so on. So longevity is something very important. It is on its own a significant topic like inflation. People are putting globally dashboard to manage inflation, because it has its impact on the fiscal planning, on the cost and revenues of countries, especially when you talk about healthcare and we talk about social protections and social assistance to elderly people. But so the first topic was about longevity risk and how to finance that. The second was how could we expand coverage? Because today 60% of people in the Arab world are in the informal sector. 60 is a lot. And it means that the social protections, the social insurance system is somehow out of sync with the realities on the ground. We need to bring this big chunk of 60% who are today in the informal sector, we need to bring them under some sort of social protection framework. And the third topic was about the lessons the world has learned from and after the pandemic, COVID-19. And this is something to do with financial literacy largely. I mean, speakers and commentators have highlighted that almost 90% of people across the world, regardless whether that is the US, the Chinese, the Arabs, the Latin Americans, 90% of people around the world learned little or nothing about finance at school. And this is very striking figure. So we need to attach more importance to financial literacy and probably embed that somehow, this cultural mindset, using our educational system. The fourth was about the pension funds, social security, and the investment returns expected. As we said, we've been reflecting on the 50th anniversary of social pensions and social insurance in the region. The last 50 years, I would say they've been buoyant, regardless of a few financial crashes in this 50-year journey. But overall, on average, if you annualize the results have been probably buoyant, achieving probably between 12 and 15% cumulatively on an annualized basis. The investment environment that we are living now is described as a low yield environment. And that's number one. And this is a global, I mean, even if we talk a little bit technical, I mean, we've already entered the negative yield when it comes to fixed income and coupons, especially in Germany, US. And when we look at the oil economy, the world is living the new normal in terms of oil economy since the last probably 7 years now. So the way the pension fund assets are invested should be changed. The new ideology, the new philosophy of how the assets are allocated managed and so on, we need to change that because the expectation of the returns are so much different from the last 50 years. And there are some recommendations towards the end of the conference. We might come to that later on. And after the investment talk, we talked about the fintech. Fintech, for your viewers, fintech means financial technology.
Right.
And it's very much about technology, the softwares, the new innovations that comes into this space and facilitates financial solutions.
Right.
Definitely wealth management, financial planning, long-term investment, long-term saving for households. These are keys to fintech.
Definitely. Fintech is actually or has become a solution for many problems that are faced around the region. We in Bahrain here have very prime examples of very good fintech applications or companies. Benefits one of them, as well as your representation of this pension plan. Now, when it comes to the conference itself, how do you value hosting a conference like this, a vital conference like this in the Kingdom of Bahrain, especially that it is considered one of the leading financial and economic hubs actually in the region? Bahrain is home to many main branches of financial institutions. We have the Bahrain Central Bank as well. So why is it important that it was held here in Bahrain?
Well, actually, Sarah, this is good that you've brought Bahrain's perspective into this. Bahrain, see, despite the catch-up work and the accomplishments of our brothers and neighbors in the GCC and the wider region, Bahrain still commands a huge respect as a mature financial market and also as a progressive financial regime, and that's the Central Bank of Bahrain. And so the region really has big respect for Bahrain's reputation in this domain. But also Bahrain, when we reflect probably the last 10, 20 years, they have been hosting the biggest banking and Islamic banking conferences for the region, probably the biggest insurance conferences, the finest asset management conferences, the best and most impressive fintech exhibitions. So we looked at this space and reflected a little bit and said, well, what's maybe missing for Bahrain is probably a strong, large regional pension conference, because as I said at the beginning of this interview, pension is almost 30% of global financial assets. So if you go to any mutual funds, if you go to any asset manager, most likely, naturally, you will find that 30%, 40% of the asset under management of that fund is assets that are coming from insurance, from social insurance and pension. But the other thing is also there has been and for the whole region, there has been no other conference around pension. So this is the only regional pension conference. And it is starting strong. This started really strong from day one, from year one. We had the World Bank, we had the OECD, we had the Arab Monetary Fund, we had the Islamic Development Fund, and all these are strong international multilateral organizations joining us. And this says two things. First of all, that pension itself is needed and is vital. And number two is that probably the quality of the agenda, the discussion, the speakers, the overall agenda has been inspiring to people.
Absolutely. When I looked at the list of speakers, that was one of the main points that what really interested me is that there was a vast participation in the conference, and it really did enrich the outcomes. And when people ask, okay, but a lot of these people were from outside of the region, how is it pertaining? It pertains because they have experience, and bringing that experience you can learn and you can put something together that is tailored to our region at that point. So can you tell us how do you value this kind of participation?
That's exactly, I think I mean, the answer is already in your question. We cannot, I mean, see, the pension experience this region has, unfortunately, is limited to a single pillar.
Yes.
So if you talk about, if you mention the OECD, the World Bank paradigm or way of thinking about pension, normally they would, if pension is a house, then they would have 3 to 6 layers probably. They would have probably the foundation, and they would call that pillar 1. Then they would have probably the ground floor, the first floor, the second floor, and so on. And each of these layers in the hierarchy would serve a certain segment in the demography.
Yes.
So probably the first one is for the very poor, for the indigenous, for people without any wage, and second one would be probably financed through the country's fiscal tax system and so on. But they serve different. But in this region, for the last 50 years, and in the case of Egypt, Egypt has probably have been having their pension system probably
the longest, maybe
probably 170 years now.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very much like the European countries, but it has always been about this government-run pension system. So our experience is limited. We all have been living the same experience. We cannot leverage, we cannot expand the learning curve if we just limit the thinking, the debate, the issues to people from the GCC, Bahrain, and the Mina region.
Absolutely.
We needed to learn from the World Bank, from the OECD, from the Australians, the New Zealanders, people from Hong Kong, and so on. And definitely UK and Germany, France. We had speakers from all these countries, and the purpose was to expand the horizon, to learn more, and if we are here to innovate and to expand in Bahrain, we need to start from where they end rather than from where they started.
Absolutely. One of the things that really changed the whole world, it changed the healthcare system, it changed the banking system, it changed even the oil system when it comes to the incomes from it, was the pandemic. So my question to you is, from your point of view, how would the current pandemic actually change the standards and the procedures of the Mina pension systems?
To talk about what the pandemic itself and how it affected people and how people respond to this, I mean, the social insurance systems, the pension systems suffered the most because they had to interfere. So all the social assistance, all these nice and benign interventions by MENA countries and the Arab countries, and on top of them was Bahrain. This is something good, but I mean, people always blame social insurance and pension systems that they are failing and they are this and they are that. And this is easy said than done. But there are good lessons in this space, and I think number one, I mean, when we talk about this effect and how people should do, we have to speak about 2 levels. The first level is probably about the social insurance and pension systems themselves, and then the second one is about people. So if we start about the social insurance and pension systems, definitely the occurrence of the pandemic is not going to be the final and the last crisis they will suffer. And so this is one more, and in addition to the financial crises that the world lived over the last probably 50 years, the pandemic here is a big challenge, and it really shakes up the funding, the stability of, and also the assets, the entire functioning of social systems, social insurance system, and therefore I think it is imperative that pension systems in the region, but also across the world, start to do stress testing scenarios, very much like what banks and insurance company have been mandated to do. And these stress scenarios, they should cover all the losses, all the actions that they are likely to take or they are expected to do should a similar crisis happen in the future. When we come to people in Bahrain, in the region, across the world, a lot of people, I mean, see, the pandemic put millions of people
Yeah.
out of jobs, out of their livelihood. And the problem is, many of the people didn't have a financial plan. Many, nor even did they have any probably emergency fund
Or savings.
for a 3 to 6 months coverage of expenses and so on. And this is a great lesson here, because you can't take it for granted that nothing will happen, or when things happens, that your governments, wherever you are in the world, the government's intervention or assistance will reach you in the right time.
Right.
So households, individuals, families needs to look into exploring or maybe taking actions around their financial resilience, financial security. We're not here asking them to become wealthy, but somehow need to have a financial plan, even a little saving, even a small saving, even some basic household saving is a must.
Absolutely.
And can be a big help when the crisis occurs.
Absolutely. Your retirement or the pension plan is made for the survival or the comfortable living after finishing that whole career aspect of one's life. Now, one of the really important things to talk about when it comes to pensions is that what the job you were doing is actually very important when it pertains to your pensions. There are a lot of things that go into it. Healthcare workers are different than bankers, are different than engineers, and everything so on. So one of the very, for me, highlights during this event was the World Bank actually announced their key findings from the future of jobs and social protection in the Mina report 2021. Basically, in this report, they turned the COVID-19 crisis into an opportunity for reform. So what can you tell us about how is that significant for our youth now that have to plan their future?
This is fantastic, Sarah, and it's good that we have the OECD and the World Bank and similar global think tanks participate with us. And I'm very close to the team from the World Bank. I'm one of their speakers and expert on this panel as well. Yes. So they before the conference they just have completed this report, which took them year and a half to compile around the region, and it was timely that they come and share with us the findings and recommendations. So I mean, it's a big, huge report, but yes, maybe we can sum it into three or four bullet points. Number one for them, the key finding is that the latest pandemic, has pushed around 26 million people in the MENA region into extreme poverty. Yeah. Extreme poverty meaning that they have a low income of just $5.5 per day. That's roughly 2 Bahraini dinar. Mm-hmm. And that the problem is if you take any demography or any population in any country or maybe in any region, so the world is divided between developed and developing countries. Yeah. And probably the percentage of people covered under any pension and social insurance system is normally higher in the developed countries versus the developing countries, because the pension vehicles and so on in the developed markets are more mature and they have diversity of these vehicles. So in the MENA region, 60% of the people are outside social insurance, and when they are outside social insurance, it's not ready that governments and countries and states have mechanism or a network to send even the social assistance if they want to, because there is no vehicle, there is no bank account. Right. So that has been difficult. And for them, for the World Bank, if the social insurance, the pension systems continue to serve only those who are working in the formal sector, then they are definitely out of sync with the realities of tomorrow. Yeah. So the realities of tomorrow is there will be a lot of people they are today in the informal sector, and tomorrow they will still continue to be in the informal sector. But we also have millions of younger workers who are not, unfortunately, who are not in an environment where they have a job for life, like our fathers and we probably have enjoyed. So they are probably in temporary work contracts, in projects, in part-time employment, freelance, and so on. So that's something important, and people in the informal sector were hit very hard because of the pandemic, and in many countries also. Thanks God, in Bahrain is one of the very few Arab countries that have social insurance for the unemployment. The social insurance for the unemployed is almost non-existent in most of the Arab countries, and that was something difficult as well. So you have a lot of people who are outside of any social protection. So what the World Bank, in this current report that the World Bank shared with us, they have a vision of building the social insurance and pension systems to be more relevant to the Arab world, more relevant to the country, and more relevant to the population. So they divided this into, I would say, 3 pillars. Number one, they want to ensure that everyone under a minimum of protection guarantee, and this is very much around the poor, around the very low income people, and this the cost for this, the budget for this comes from the country.
Right.
And this is just to ensure that people are not on the street, people have some dignity for their livelihood and so on. Then we have the second pillar, which is called social insurance, but on an actuarially fairer paradigm.
Okay.
This is a little bit technical. So in the insurance system or the pension system, people contribute while they are working, so when they retire, they take a payout.
Yes.
There must always be a relationship or a balance or some math between what we pay in a system and then what we take out and live off later on when we retire. So most of the core issues in the calculus of these pension funds is that what people contribute, the contributions are much more smaller than the actual cost of pension payout when people retire. So the call for the World Bank is that we have an actuarially fair, meaning we need to have higher contributions if people are to have adequate and meaningful level of wealth that they want to maintain in their retirement. And mind you, this is not the first one for the indigenous segment, but this is for those who are looking for achieving a relatively decent income when they retire, very similar to when they've been working. And the third one is they call for installing or putting in place a third layer or a third pillar, and that's called the private pension. It's a voluntary pension layer. Every household, every people, every individual, whether they are in the formal or in the formal, whether they are citizens or expat workers, they can subscribe to that and secure some sort of a retirement income when they retire.
After seeing that report and talking about it, it's very important to really shed the light that Bahrain specifically, its pension system has changed drastically, keeps on changing over the years to the better. How do you value the constant development that is witnessed by the pension system in the kingdom?
See, if we reflect on the progress of social insurance systems in Bahrain, for me as an observer and a specialist in this domain, I can say that our leadership has been very keen to preserve and not to touch any gains or rights for citizens on one side, but also not to place any further burden on business and business owners. And as someone probably, I've probably done most of the analysis of pension and social insurance in Bahrain through lots, probably around 20 articles in English and Arabic. And when I go over the history and the cumulative growth of social insurance in Bahrain, it's so clear that all the decisions and the actions taken by our governments have been directed at maintaining the citizens' rights and gains, and reducing burden and taxation and liabilities on businesses and companies. And that has been very nice, actually, for the last 30 years. But in my opinion, it is about time that our government start taking the measures, the actions, the reforms that to preserve the sustainability of the pension funds, especially that the financial conditions of the social insurance funds that we have in Bahrain have reached alarming levels. But this is not peculiar to Bahrain. If we look at some of our neighbors, even the oil-rich neighbors, as well as across the Arab world, footing the pension bill is not something easy. Even great economies such as Germany, UK, US, Canada, they are finding it challenging.
Yes, especially with the pointers that you talked about. We have an aging community, and at the same time, the levels that are being put into the pension system are vastly new because of the pandemic and everything that has affected the last years.
Also, Sarah, because the pension funds themselves, the ones that are similar to the ones across the Arab world, which is called defined benefit, they have flaws. They have inherent flaws in the design. And because of these flaws, there are challenges in their sustainability. And to give you a little bit, I mean, these funds were designed somehow like 200 years ago by the German prime minister at the time. And longevity at the time when these were produced, the calculus, the financial model, that people would normally retire at probably 55, 60. And most likely, small segment of that would live 10 years after they retire. But that was long ago.
Yes.
Unfortunately, but even at that time, the pension funds were designed so that people retire at 60, at the age of 60. Today, people in the region, in the last, I would say, 50, 60 years, people have gained in terms of longevity and life expectancy around, I would say, 18 years in the whole GCC. And this is due to the improved health conditions and so on. So today people easily live 20 to 30 to 35 years in retirement.
Absolutely.
And this longevity, this much longer period of retirement that needs to be financed and funded has not been factored in the very design of pension funds when they were envisioned 200 years ago.
Right.
So that's why we say that this has embedded flaws, and many countries, governments and private sectors, they have abandoned this type of funds, and they have instead innovated new ways and vehicles and systems of pension and social insurance. Very common among them is the defined contribution and the collective defined contribution funds, and these are innovative pension vehicle for accumulating savings, but they have lower liabilities on governments and sponsors.
Right. Before we go to our next question, you actually talked in the beginning a little bit about doing some kind of financial awareness from early on in schools. How is it important to have awareness even now for the people that are about to retire or that are in mid-job? Is there any way of doing or spreading this kind of awareness?
It is so vital, actually. A lot of governments, a lot of universities are waking up to the reality that this is a must, that there is a long-term journey between any man, any woman, in their entire life cycle with money. So whenever they finish college, they go and start working, they get the salary, and then suddenly there is a salary landing in their bank account, and what they don't know what to do with it. All they know is probably they go and take some money from the ATM machine, and maybe some of them they start buying expensive cars,
Right.
and some of them start to travel the world, and they take a lot of consumption debt, unfortunately. And this is alarming, this is frightening. We have a lifelong journey and friendship and a relationship with our money. It is money that makes us start the life and either start it and maintaining successfully or fail miserably in it, yet we have zero knowledge or little knowledge in how to manage money. When we have money, we don't know how to look at it, how we classify it, how we divide it, how we manage it. It's not clear. And there are some of us who keep a lot of cash in the bank, and they think, wow, we've made it and we're smart because we have a lot of money in the bank. But guess what? If you have a lot of cash and that's sitting in the bank for 15 or 20 or 30 years, maybe that's not the best and optimal way to put it. But the best way is to look at your money and say, and then you are able to tell, this is the money that I would most likely need maybe in the next 6 to 9 months, and this needs to be liquid and available to me anytime. And this is probably the money that I will use, I don't know, maybe for my daughter's wedding or to buy a new car, and I have certain access to that. But any money that I don't need for 5 years or more, they should be invested in vehicles, in instruments, in accounts,
Assets,
in funds where they achieve, I would say, decent returns that is worth of the time value of money, and that also helps the compounding the growth of that money.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So basically, invest that money in something that will appreciate, not depreciate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so
Absolutely,
yeah.
because if you keep it all in cash,
Yeah.
the cash return in banks is probably, I don't know, probably 50 basis point, or maybe at the max it's 1%, where inflation easily, globally, regionally is definitely in excess of 3%.
Right, and thankfully, actually, our region, Bahrain specifically, there are a lot of opportunities for investment in different companies and growing companies actually in the region. So, my next question to you is: what are the main recommendations and outcomes of this conference, and what are the suggested procedures that should be implemented as soon as possible?
In the conference itself is largely around thought leadership, around institutional awareness, around public awareness, government awareness, but we don't have an official government mechanism to make the recommendations compulsory or are translated into laws and so on. However, we every year when we finish the conference, we come up with the conference takeaways or recommendations. So for the 5 sessions we had this year, the first recommendation was around the necessity that pension funds and their actuaries and their managements, they need to have a deeper understanding of the populations, of the demographics they are covering, and that they need to have better understanding of aging, maybe using some sort of a precise dynamic life tables, because the life tables is something that the insurance and the reinsurance industry would use to put some estimates around the life expectancy or the likely life expectancy of people who have life insurance,
Right.
so that they know the timing, the aging of these liabilities when they come. For the second session around, I would say, coverage, in a view of that across the world, so today 40% of the world population are outside of any pension system.
Okay.
And if you look at probably Southeast, I mean, if you talk about India, Africa, and so on, 40% of the world is not under any coverage. In the region, 60%. And they are in the formal sector, meaning they are outside the social insurance, but also in the GCC itself, we have more than 50% of our workers are expat workers.
Yes.
And guess what? These workers sometimes, when they come, it's not just 1 or 2 years and then they leave. They like the place, they like the country,
or 20, 30 years.
Yeah, or the country or the employer, the company where they work, like them, like their contributions. They like the people, they like the culture. So they stay here 5, 15, 20 years. They have children in this country.
Yes.
So they need to be covered. So the recommendation of this second session was around the possibility of having a universal tier or something of an international standard, and it's probably provided by the private sector, whereby some sort of a generic pension saving plan could be introduced.
Right.
And it allows access to everyone. In the third session, which is around the pandemic and financial literacy, and this is, I think we covered this nicely, it is timed that probably a lot of, I would say, education authorities, financial authorities, maybe the Central Bank of Bahrain, the BIBF, the Ministry of Education, Bahrain Bourse, all these three have been doing, I would say, great efforts, nice strides. They are trying to have financial literacy seminars, competitions, especially Bahrain Bourse. They have a nice tradition that has been going probably more than 20 years now, involving universities, high school students as well. That should continue. In our company, we have involved the George Washington University twice this year. They participated with us they participated with us in lots of research around financial literacy, and this is very hands-on primary research. Although it covers Western and US demographics, but it's so much relevant to us. And they have spoken with us twice. They have a very dedicated global financial literacy excellence centers that is prominently featured in the Financial Times as well. They've been with us in the last 2 years. Then the fourth recommendation was around the investment of pension funds. And the panelist says it is time that pension funds and their trustees and their board of directors look around, not just to be focused locally. They should diversify the geography of the assets where they are invested, but they should also try to invest in private assets. That's beyond the traditional floor of equities and fixed income. It's called alternative assets.
Okay.
And they need to access smart managers meaning managers who do the smart beta and smart alpha, and these are specialist managers who go beyond the normal investment processes, and so that because the pension funds, when they receive the contributions, they use something called discount rate. So they discount you, they accept you as a subscriber with a certain contributions, in the hope that this is a small cost, but over time this will grow and be able to cover the pension payout. So they apply either, it's a two-way, whatever you want to call it. Right. It's either the retain goal or the discounting rate. They both, at the end of the day, reach to the same payout that is to be reached. And the final one was around Fintech. And in Fintech, when we use apps, as we spoke before, even the studio, when people use apps and it's something easy, practical, highly usable, and people are able on their own, as a do-it-yourself, start a savings plan and start a pension plan, and they also have a choice on how they want to invest it, whether using a Sharia compliant or conventional investment or ESG, green investment, stuff like that. And they have a dashboard on their progress, how they are going with that. This is very helpful. So people, I mean, we are able for the first time to decentralize the security retirement, the whole pension game, from being a government-run pension bureaucracy into something vital, something dynamic, something that the youth can set up, can manage, can change, can edit, and can talk about, and so on.
It involves the individual.
Absolutely.
At that point.
Yeah.
Before my last question to you today is about the Mina pension system. Now, we've talked about in this show about everything that might change the Mina system. The pandemic came, new jobs are on the table, new assessments of incomes for the country. Not any more oil based, but there's tourism, there's healthcare, there are so different things. So, from your point of view, how do you see the future of Mina pension systems?
That's a good question. I mean, let us start with these assumptions. The countries that have achieved adequate, sustainable pension arrangements are less than a handful across the world.
Wow.
So it's not about the size of your GDP or economy. It's also there is a social contract involved between the state, the constitution, and the people. And changing pensions or sorting out the issues of pension is more about the political economy, the political arrangements, and the political promises than about the technical. Because if it's all technical, then we know that we have a funding issue. All we need is probably reduce the pension payout. But this is a lot easier said than done.
Yes.
You cannot reduce people pension and pension payouts, even if you just remove small features like indexation, or what we call the increase, the annual increase, then there is a big public cry out there. This is not something acceptable. So 40% of the global population is outside any sort of social insurance today. 60% in our region, the MENA region, is outside any social insurance coverage or pension coverage today. And if you look widely at the pension funds that we have across the Arab world, it is very unlikely that they will be sustainable themselves as funds, but even and more reasonable to think that they are sustainable, but maybe the pension payouts, the pension benefits will not be sustainable. So what should we do? As governments, as people, as policymakers, we need to start moving. So if we look at the learning curve, if we look at the global best practice, if we look at the global experience, they have done the following. First of all, we need to establish a wider institutional framework for pension beyond a single pillar, which is the government pension fund. You need bigger institutions, you need layers, you need diversification of vehicles, you need stakeholders, you need policies. But right now, all of that is concentrated in one single pillar, and this is a lot of liability on the government. So when we do that, we can also, in parallel, we can start building a savings economy. Right now, I mean, you, me, and a lot of us, we've been lured by banks to take a lot of debts and credit cards and spend left and spend right, and we don't have any sort of financial planning. The policymakers, the governments in the region, they can rethink that, and if they really want to leverage that, is because right now our local economies, Bahrain and the whole Arab world, they try to attract foreign direct investment, FDI, and most of that is relied on foreign FDI to come from foreign investors to come. I think if we start to build domestic vehicles to attract household saving, people saving, if there is an engine that is government endorsed for saving, then households and families and individuals will try to save, and suddenly or spontaneously we will have billions garnered, accumulated, and these are available for investing locally, for creating jobs, for creating growth. And then the local governments will be hopefully outside of the mercy of the foreign investors who come sometimes with very difficult conditions. Number 3 is we need to diversify the vehicles that are specifically designed for pension saving to be beyond the government pension fund. And this is very much probably through the regulated and licensed private sector providers of pensions, life insurance, and private pension providers, wealth managers, and so on. That's the only lesson. That's the only way out of our conundrum in pensions.
That's amazing, and it's very comprehensive in detail. I mean, Bahrain is a country that supports small and medium businesses. We have a lot of very good businesses that have already started and grown, although the pandemic was there. So it's a very bright future. Thank you so much for coming today and answering our questions.
It's a pleasure, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And we'd like to thank you, dear viewers, for watching us, and we will see you next week in another episode of Untitled Chapter.